published 0419s, the 18th of November 2017, updated 0356s, the 19th of November 2017. Clinging to his no powerless post, longtime Zimbabwe President Robert Mugabe is set to discuss his expected exit with the army commander who put him under house arrest. And a day after huge crowds rallied in the capital for Mugabe to go, the ruling party's Central Committee is expected to meet Sunday on demands by provincial branches to recall Mugabe as party leader. The meeting also is expected to reinstate the vice president whose firing nearly 2 weeks ago led the military to step in. Mugabe's talks with Army Commander Constantino Chiwenga are the second round of negotiations on an exit with a veneer of dignity as the military tries to avoid accusations of a coup. This time, the talks do not appear to include a South African government delegation. The meeting follows rumors that the dictator had fled the country after hundreds of thousands took to the streets to protest against his rule. Video footage from protests obtained exclusively by Mile Online showed angry crowds tearing down a huge billboard of Mugabe outside the headquarters of the ruling ZANU party in central Harare. There were rumors that Mugabe had fled the country after hundreds of thousands took to the streets to protest against his rule. Armed soldiers control a euphoric crowd marching near State House in Harare, demanding the departure of President Robert Mugabe. Protesters gather at a demonstration of tens of thousands at Zimbabwe grounds in Harare, Zimbabwe. On Saturday, Robert Mugabe came under overwhelming pressure to step down as it was announced that he will meet the head of Zimbabwe's armed forces Sunday morning. The footage shows dramatic scenes that would have been unthinkable just a few days ago. Senior figures in ZANU, Zimbabwe's ruling party, gathered at their headquarters in the capital, Harare, on Sunday ahead of an emergency meeting to discuss calls to expel longtime President Robert Mugabe as party leader. Soldiers checked vehicles at the gate and a military vehicle parked inside the grounds as leaders converged in the area. The military has Mugabe under house arrest after moving in last week, angered by Mugabe's firing of his longtime deputy. Zimbabwe's parliament will definitely put in motion a process to impeach Mugabe, the main opposition's parliamentary chief whip said on Sunday, adding that they have been in discussions with the ZANU party to act jointly. ZANU is expected to continue with the process of formally expelling Mr. Mugabe from the party after all 10 of Zimbabwe's provinces passed no-confidence motions against him on Friday. Innocent Guineas with the MDCT party told the Associated Press if Mugabe is not gone by Tuesday, then as sure as the sun rises from the east, impeachment process will kick in. The MDCT has unsuccessfully tried to impeach Mugabe in the past, but now the ruling party has turned against him. The ruling party on Sunday is likely to fire Mugabe as party leader at a Central Committee meeting. State-run media also says Mugabe will meet the army commander who put him under house arrest for another round of talks. Hundreds of thousands of people took to the streets of Harare to demand the end of dictator Robert Mugabe's rule. Some of the protesters tore down the sign for Mugabe Road, which in recent years would have been met with a severe punishment. The army has also brought intense pressure to bear upon the 93-year-old, threatening to stand aside and allow him to be lynched if he does not stand down soon, a senior politician told Mile Online. In an exclusive interview, Christopher Mavengwa, the chairman of the National War Veterans Association and a former ZANU minister, revealed the army gave the dictator a message earlier Saturday. Either he steps down or they will let the people into his mansion to take him. The army is threatening to unleash the people and let Mugabe be lynched. The general said they will not shoot the people for him. Instead, they will abandon their posts and leave him to his fate. Mr. Mavengwa added at first, the army was holding him prisoner. Now they are protecting him from the people. His comments came as rumors spread that the 93-year-old dictator has already fled the country after hundreds of thousands of people took to the streets of Harare to demand that he stands down. Robert Mugabe is shaken, tired and dejected and has been desperately asking members of his family for advice about whether he should resign, one of the dictator's nephews told Mile Online, as rumors spread that he had gone missing from his mansion. A separate source said the despot was last seen at about 653 am on Saturday and that his phone has been unreachable ever since. However, one of his nephews, Patrick Zuo, said the dictator was ready to die for what is correct and had no intention of stepping down. Thousands of people took to the streets of Harare on Saturday in a historic show of unity to demand an end to the 37-year reign of dictator Robert Mugabe. Military helicopters flew low overhead as huge crowds marched into the center of the city, waving Zimbabwean flags and chanting "Remove the dictator and Mugabe, our country is not your property." Zimbabweans carried their country's flag and chanted "Remove the dictator and Mugabe, our country is not your property" as they voiced their demand for him to leave office after 37 years in power. Some The crowd also voiced their support for sacked Vice President Emmanuel Crocodile Mnangagwa, the favorite to become the next leader, by shouting Ngwina, or Crocodile, in support of sacked Vice President Emmanuel Crocodile Mnangagwa. Mugabe has been given an ultimatum of 24 hours to resign by the powerful National Liberation War Veterans Association. A soldier takes a selfie in front of a protester. The army has given its backing to the demonstration against Mugabe, who in the past brutally stamped out opposition to his government during Mugabe's rule. Forced rallies were often staged to support him, but there was not a single counter-protester coming out in support of him. Some also shouted Ngwina, or Crocodile, in support of sacked Vice President Emmanuel Crocodile Mnangagwa, the favorite to become the next leader. Fiery speeches were delivered at the Harare football stadium to a crowd of hundreds of thousands after a day of chaotic anti-Mugabe parades through the city. Several speakers shouted "Viva Zimbabwe" to prolonged cheers and singing from the crowds, mixed with blasts of over the loudspeakers. Mugabe and his typist cum wife must go home, said Victor Madamiranda, the Secretary General of the powerful War Veterans Association. Let's go and take back the country from the State House. He added, if he's not at the State House, let's go to the Blue Roof, referring to Mr. Mugabe's £7.5 million mansion where he is under house arrest. Opamuchingori Kashiri, the country's environment minister who was Mr. Mugabe's girlfriend in the 80s and 90s and has had physical fights with his wife Grace, cited, "Thank you all for being resolute. Now let's remain focused and finish what we started. Let's take Mugabe with a strong grip and remove him." The mass show of defiance comes as Mugabe has been dramatically thrown out of his own party after all 10 provinces of Zimbabwe passed a no-confidence motion in the dictator. It makes it almost impossible for him to continue to cling to power. The decision will be ratified on Sunday and put into effect next week. Frank Mutsindikwa, 34, said, "These are tears of joy. I've been waiting all my life for this day. Free at last. We are free at last." The 93-year-old will be removed as the head of ZANU-PF but technically remains as president. However, Emmerson the Crocodile Mnangagwa, the sacked vice president who returned to Zimbabwe on Wednesday, will be installed as the new party leader. It was confirmed on Saturday. It was an unprecedented show of defiance and unity in this notoriously divided country, as ordinary Zimbabweans from across the political spectrum came together as one to oppose the dictator. Robert Mugabe at the student graduation ceremony at Zimbabwe Open University on the outskirts of Harare. His last public appearance, Mugabe was holed up in his Blue Roof mansion, which he shares with his wife Grace, who has lavishly decorated it. Zimbabweans from all parts of society came together in a show of unity to demand the removal of President Robert Mugabe. Members of the powerful war veterans, traditionally a source of support for Mugabe, stand guard at the stage. Prior to the mass action protests, there were fears the opposition rally would degenerate into violence, as happened in 2013 when crowds went on the rampage in Harare. After an opposition rally, there was spirit of harmony in the crowd. The sense of liberation from the slaves of the dictator's secret police was tangible. All 10 provinces controlled by the ZANU-PF also passed no-confidence motions in the leader, heaping further pressure on him to step down. Crowds gathered at football pitches close to the city center and marched towards Freedom Square. In Harare, ecstatic crowds marched through central Harare, cheering and hugging soldiers, honking horns, dancing, and singing. Mugabe was mocked for his record in the war background that led to the foundation of Zimbabwe, with one war veteran saying he only came to the front once. The closest Mugabe ever was to the fighting was 400 kilometers away. Ordinary Zimbabweans said they felt like they were dreaming after the 37-year-old dictatorship crumbled before their eyes. Even formerly loyal party members openly called Mr. Mugabe a dictator and united their efforts in trying to force him to stand down. Ecstatic crowds marched through central Harare, cheering and hugging soldiers, honking horns, dancing, and singing, "Bob, you have sold out the country. Remember, we are the ones who put you there and we are now removing you." Ordinary Zimbabweans said they felt like they were dreaming after the 37-year-old dictatorship crumbled before their eyes. "It's like Christmas," said one marcher, Fred Mube, who said Zimbabweans have been suffering for a long time. Saturday's protest represented a turning point for the southern African state, where for 4 decades the public criticism of Mr. Mugabe has been met with brutal punishment and even death. It came as Mr. Mugabe was given an ultimatum of 24 hours to resign by the powerful National Liberation War Veterans Association. In a press conference, a spokesman for the group mocked the elderly dictator, saying Mugabe has no war background. He only came to the front once. The closest Mugabe ever was to the fighting was 400 kilometers away. During the dictator's rule, forced rallies were often staged to support him. By comparison, everybody attended Saturday's march of their own free will and there was not a single counter-protester coming out in support of Mr. Mugabe. There were fears that Saturday's event may degenerate into violence, as happened in 2013 when crowds went on the rampage in Harare after an opposition rally. March began in a spirit of harmony, however, and the sense of liberation from the slurs of the dictator's secret police was tangible. Crowds gathered at football pitches close to the city center and marched towards Freedom Square, formerly known as the Robert Mugabe Square, where a number of political leaders from all parties were to address demonstrators. One of the marchers said it was like Christmas. Jubilant protesters ride on top of a bus in the streets of Harare. There was a festive atmosphere on the streets of Harare where people seemed overjoyed at the prospect of Mugabe finally being forced out of power. The security forces stood by as the demonstration, in contrast to previous year when protests were brutally quashed. Buses were laid on by the ZANF to ferry thousands of people to the capital to take part in the protest. A woman holds picture of General Constantino Chiwenga, who led the coup against Robert Mugabe. Some of the money for mobilizing demonstrators was provided by the army, which spearheaded the attempt to remove Mugabe. The historic rally was all the more remarkable for having been organized by Mr. Mugabe's own party, the ZANF, which until Tuesday had treated the despot like a god. All that changed Saturday as formerly loyal party members openly called Mr. Mugabe a dictator and united their efforts in trying to force him to stand down. Last night, activists armed with megaphones toured towns and villages all over the country in ZANF-branded vehicles, calling for as many people to attend the demonstration as possible. Opposition parties followed the ZANF's lead, mobilizing their grassroots network to ensure a major turnout amongst their own supporters. It is thought that some of the money for mobilizing demonstrators was provided by the army, which spearheaded the dramatic attempt to remove Mr. Mugabe. Buses were laid on by the ZANF to ferry thousands of people to the capital to take part in the protest, thought to be the biggest demonstration of its kind in Zimbabwean history. Mr. Mugabe, meanwhile, remained defiant in his Blue Roof mansion, refusing to step down despite the massive pressure heaped upon him by his political rivals, foreign leaders and now his own people. The demonstrators vented their fury with the president by stamping on his name on the road sign.